Yes, I know, everyone's talking about Aemeath, but I refuse to use that skip button if I can help it. First, we have to talk about Act 2. After Lahai-Roi Act I left me very irritated, I really hoped the second chapter would get things back on track. In some ways it did, and some aspects of it made exactly the improvements I and many others had been hoping for, but at the same time, it added its own fair share of new frustrations. I'm going to assume a lot of people loved it anyway, since it did have so many positive aspects, so to explain where I'm coming from, we're going to have to talk about one of my favorite author's ideas about the fundamentals of writing, since his perspective pinpoints the part of Mornye's story which left me feeling a little let down once more. But before we get into it, we apparently have to talk about whether it makes sense to review a section of a story in isolation. My previous WuWa video explored the problems I had with Lahai-Roi's opening act. To summarize, while the presentation was fantastic as always, I was unhappy with the characters, underwhelmed by the action, and frustrated by the lack of setup for the region's wider story. I was disappointed to see Chisa completely sidelined, since the previous patch had made such a big point of setting up that we would travel together and then start school together. I liked the idea behind Lynae's backstory, but felt her personality didn't fit, and I was frustrated to see any potential consequences for her actions brushed aside so quickly. And I felt that as a whole, the quest neglected building the world or setting up future conflicts in favor of hype moments and heroism, which didn't make sense in the context of the situation they had set up. Overall, it felt like their focus was on pushing the current banner character and not on telling an interesting story across the whole of Lahai-Roi. I hear the exploration quests did a fantastic job of building the world, but in my opinion, the main quests need to stand alone. Basically, I thought WuWa could do much better. Many people agreed with my perspective, and as always, many people disagreed as well. That's kinda how opinions on stories are supposed to work, and discussing our different perspectives is half the fun. Some, however, were adamant that it's too early to judge an entire story when only the first chapter has been released. And I mean, they're absolutely right. Anyone who gives a final verdict on the story they haven't finished is being disingenuous. That would be like watching the first episode of Freerun and declaring whether or not the series is good or bad based off your experience of that one part of the story. But that's not what anyone said at all. We were talking about how well Act 1 works as an introduction, which is a whole different discussion. An introduction to any story has specific goals. It needs to introduce the characters, the setting, and the plot, while also telling an interesting tale of its own. Of course, when the wider story is episodic, the first chapter doesn't have to introduce all the things the future chapters will cover, but it does need to give the audience something which will pull them forward. Lahai-Roi Act I absolutely did just that for many people, but it didn't for many others, and it's interesting to figure out why. Even if later parts of a story recontextualize the introduction and add layers which were hidden on first viewing, the added context does not change how effective the opening was at that first-time experience. Any difference between a first-time watch and a rewatch just makes it a more interesting discussion to have. There is nothing wrong with watching the first episode of Freerun, analyzing which parts of it you liked and which you didn't, and whether it made you want to watch the rest of the story. Many people do exactly this for Freerun, for other anime, for TV, for film series, for books. We should be able to have those same discussions for video game stories too. And if you're still unconvinced that people should ever critique before something is finished, ask yourself, is Lahai-Roi's story done? Is Aemeath's story over? There are a ton of people praising 3.1, and if I enjoy it, then I'll absolutely praise it too. Do you think we should all shut up about it because our perspective might be changed by what happens afterwards? If your gut reaction is that it's okay to praise something before it's done, but not okay to critique, you might want to think about why that is, and what the consequences would be if nobody ever shared their honest thoughts. There is no such thing as unbiased opinion. Every person comes into a story with a unique set of expectations and preferences, and their experience will naturally be unique as well. Anyone who claims they're unbiased is either lying to you or they're lying to themselves. The good ones will explain where their perspective comes from so you can compare and contrast it to your own. Many of us enjoy a story more if we talk about it afterwards. If you don't, then that's okay too. It's not for everyone. You just might be better off not clicking on my videos. With that in mind, it would feel weird to skip Act 2 entirely. I had originally planned to play it straight after Act 1, but the first act left such a sour aftertaste that I decided to hold off for a couple of weeks and come back later so I could give it a fair chance. I hoped it would get me back on track and played it a week after 3.1 dropped so I could maybe play the new story straight away. Instead, I still found it kind of mixed. It addressed several of my issues with the opening act, and overall I'd say it was a decent story which lives up to what we usually get from WuWa, but it was still far from the heights that WuWa can achieve when they get it right, though for different reasons than usual. Since Lynae's presence still left me frustrated, as we'll get to in a second, I decided not to continue straight away. I'm writing this halfway through Aemeath's banner, and it'll be tough to get this video out before her banner ends, but I'm hoping to find the time so I can maybe pull for her if she does turn out to be as memorable a character as my other favourites in the game. We'll just have to wait and see. The start of Act 2 kinda proved that Lynae was the problem for me all along. I find her to be a walking fountain of frustration. Maybe I'm just fundamentally not understanding who she's supposed to be, but I thought her biggest fear was that she'd lose her place in Lahai-Roi. She did get kicked out for a brief moment, but she got a second chance. So now she's on thin ice, yet straight away she starts looking for ways to break the rules again? What? Why? If she's so in love with the idea of being at the academy, or at least desperate not to go back to the new federation, why is she so intent on avoiding classes, breaking rules, and risking being kicked out for good? I could get behind it if we were given some explanation. Maybe she's always missing classes because she has ADHD and she struggles to curb those tendencies. Or maybe she doesn't like classes and studying, and the part of the academy she loves is the community aspect of student life, and it's tough for her to find a balance between the two. Maybe she was just struggling with the lessons. There are tons of ways they could have made all this make sense, many of which would take just one line of dialogue to set up, but instead we get nothing. I also still find it jarring that she retains that false identity she took from a dead student, even after she came clean. It's a little weird that her crimes are forgiven with no consequences aside from some stricter monitoring, but universities often skirt the law on things like that. But the identity part is begging for an explanation, or at least an acknowledgement that it's a thing. And it could lead to such interesting complications. For example, what if the condition of her remaining at the academy could be that she has to act as a double agent working against the Fractidus, and therefore she has to continue with her fake identity? Every minute Lynae's on screen, I feel bombarded with all these inconsistencies and all the potential this character has which is being ignored, and it makes me feel like the story just does not respect its audience. Thankfully, it turns out this is limited to Lynae, and her part in this act was small in the end. Instead, it focused on Mornye. I kinda like the little professor, but I felt we only got a surface level story from her and was left a little underwhelmed. I loved her trailer's portrayal of her disability as perfectly normal. It didn't hold her back from chasing her dreams, and her prosthetic legs were only needed after she suffered a separate, more catastrophic injury after she selflessly put herself in harm's way. I started the quest hopeful that she'd be another memorable character. She had some good moments in the quest which revealed different facets: her firm but fair approach when dealing with students, her comfort in following Rover's lead when she felt out of her depth, her strength in her confrontation with Ingvar, and her nerdy tendency to chatter about her scientific interests. I liked her mix of shy softness and inner steel. I just wanted more. I still don't feel like I know her, or her history, or why she is the way she is. If this was a sign we could expect more from her in the future, it would be great. It's exactly the kind of feeling of anticipation which I felt was missing from the first act after all. But while I'd have hope for Kuro to continue a plot-related setup in a future act, I'm still skeptical that they'll pay off character-related setups once their debut patch is over, except perhaps for a Regent Sentinel Resonator. I hope they prove my fears to be unfounded. Since her backstory is intertwined with Rover's, there's at least a spark of hope that we'll get further depth once we finally explore that part of Rover's past. But I can't help but look back at how little time they gave to returning characters towards the end of Renacita and worry that they won't give her the depth she perhaps deserved. I still think main story quests which explore a specific character can be great when done right. Just look at Kartithia and Frolova for example, but it doesn't always work that well, and in cases like Mornye's, I wish they'd still add separate character quests. Characters aside, one notable improvement in this quest was how much Lynae's presence carried over into the next act compared to Chisa. She showed up at the start for the introductory scene, and more importantly, had a key moment where her existence was relevant to the story later on, and then she returned at the end for the denouement. Both of her main appearances were scenes where Rover, Lynae, and Mornye interacted together. In other words, she was given roughly the same amount of presence and importance to the story that many of us had expected of Chisa in Act 1. And yet, despite what some people claimed would happen, somehow this didn't cause the story to devolve into a painful yapfest with all the characters standing around and talking for hours on end. Characters can return and be involved in the story without it blowing up the scope, destroying the pacing of the story, or taking the spotlight away from the rover. And it was great to see that one section from Mornye's perspective. Rover can still be the main protagonist even when they're not the center of every scene, and it was refreshing to actually see Mornye split off to find some answers on her own, and even deal with one potential bad guy without Rover stepping in. This is the kind of thing people are actually asking for when they say they wish Rover didn't solve all the problems in every story. Despite those positives, I felt the quest had a couple of problems too, and to explain where I'm coming from, we need to look at the promises, progress, and payoffs, which are the foundation of the story. This is a concept popularized by one of the most successful fantasy authors in the world, Brandon Sanderson, and I think it applies to all storytelling, regardless of whether it follows Western norms or not, with some rare exceptions. Stories start with promises. These promises include plot expectations, like the goals a character wants to achieve or the problems they want to solve, but also include more nebulous things like genre, tone, or pacing. After promises are planted in the audience's mind, the story then makes progress with respect to each promise. Characters work towards their goals and try to solve their problems, and the contents of the story slowly fulfill those more nebulous expectations too. Progress doesn't always happen in the right direction, but it's essential to a story. And finally, each promise needs a satisfactory payoff. This can be a direct conclusion, which gives us the exact thing which was promised, but it can also be a subversion of the original promise, a twist or an escalation which acts as a new promise to take the story in a different direction. This framework explains why so many were so annoyed with Kuro's handling of Chisa, for example. The promise was very clear, we saw some progress, and yet the payoff was missing. The same thing happened with several other stories in the past. They set up interesting promises, but didn't give up satisfying payoff. It is, of course, possible that they'll revisit them in the future, but I don't think I'll hold my breath. And it also puts a painful spotlight on one of the things I said at the end of my previous video. When Rover was hailed as a hero who saved the academy, I assumed Kuro was setting up an explanation for why Rover would be treated as a beloved celebrity student, fawned over by everyone on campus. Somehow, Kuro managed to surprise me here, and not in a good way. This was another promise with no payoff at all. So far, none of the NPCs we encounter say anything which references the entire episode. The people who knew Rover's past already knew they were a hero, but it's weird that it's not mentioned at all when we're talking to students and parents. Hopefully this will come up in 3.1 or something. For the world to feel real to me, important events like a pair of students saving the academy on their own need to have some kind of payoff in the chapters which come after they're introduced. Even if it's just a single line of dialogue somewhere which has a student be like, "Oh, that was you? That's awesome." But what surprised me the most about Act 2 was that while it does a much better job at executing on its own payoffs, it had a completely different issue, which is just as baffling. The plot felt off to me because they kept on setting up interesting situations, which came across as promises that I would experience an interesting story, but then skipped the progress aspect and jumped straight to the payoff. Of course, this was not the case for all the promises they made. The main goal which drove the narrative was the ceremony to replace the reactor drive, and every step along the way did move us towards ensuring it would happen. So I'd be unsurprised if most people were completely unbothered by the odd handling of the smaller promises and payoffs. The first couple of sections were fine since they were setting up that central plot, but once we went to the Roya tribe, it started happening. We talked to Astrid, who refuses to answer some of our questions. Is this a promise of a mystery plot where we collect clues and then confront her so she tells the truth? No, we fight a single void swarm, and the moment the fight is done, she wanders over and confesses everything. So we head over to Halderheim and encounter an elder who is suspicious of outsiders. Maybe we'll need to do something to gain their full trust? Nope, our friendly Soliskin grants us so much implicit trust that not only can we stay, we're treated as long-standing friends of the tribe. We want to meet the reclusive leaders of the Roya, who live in isolation and refuse to see anyone, including their own tribespeople. Perhaps we'll need to find some way to sneak in, or prove that we're worthy, or get their attention some other way. Nope, we're told that there was a prophecy that we would arrive, which had nothing else to say other than this person will be allowed in to meet the Six, and no further signs are needed. We meet the Shaper, who explains the tragedy that destroyed the minds of the other 5 of the Heliotic 6. Sounds like a super interesting plot to explore. Will we revive them, or replace them, or rebuild the machine to work without them? No, the Shaper just asks Rover for permission to do it all himself, and a simple yes solves everything. When the Shaper takes control, he starts to feel pain, and the corruption begins to take over. Will we maybe need to fight it back, or deal with a half-corrupted Shaper, or anything like that? No, the Shaper is strong enough to power through with the help of the Soliskins. To people who didn't find this frustrating, this probably sounds like nitpicking. After all, at least they are providing payoffs to each of these points, and each step along the way did move the plot towards the overarching goal. It's just generally better to introduce fewer ideas and reuse them throughout the story rather than continually introduce and then instantly pay off new ones. Constantly introducing problems that solve themselves but a few lines of dialogue later just makes them feel redundant. The problem is that each of those ideas sounds like the kind of story I'd love to experience. The Heliotic 6 section especially was some stellar world building with fascinating implications and presentation to match. Exactly the kind of science fantasy I was so excited for when WuWa first came out. It's hard to describe how frustrating it is to think that you're about to get something engaging only for it to be skipped past instantly. It feels like you're going on a trip around the world where you never actually leave the airport. You fly to all these beautiful places, see them spread out before you from the window as you descend, and then get on the plane to the next location without experiencing the place for yourself. And that's all ignoring the anime logic issues like how Mornye is able to survive on a metal floor right next to a flood of molten lava, or where all those gigantic robot worms came from, or how shooting at an explosion would stop it from exploding. I don't mind an exaggerated climax if the story which leads up to it is engaging. When these kinds of deeper problems stick out to you, it's hard to enjoy the parts of the story which are actually done well. They break your immersion, which shatters the illusion of the whole experience. This isn't bias, it's simple human nature. This quest had so many good ingredients which I would have loved to explore. It's frustrating that we didn't. And by the end, once again, this quest didn't really give me anything to look forward to beyond Rover is occasionally experiencing frequency loss, there's a mysterious voice to investigate, and the Fractidus and the Threnodian exist. Maybe that's enough to get most people excited for the next chapter. I'm left thinking about what could have been instead. So, where does that leave me? Honestly, in a very familiar place with WuWa. Act 2 is not bad. In many ways, it's competent, polished, and clearly made with care. It fixes some of the most obvious problems of Act 1, shows flashes of genuinely strong storytelling, and hints of the brilliance that Kuro are capable of when they do deliver. But it also reinforces that same lingering frustration, the feeling that the story keeps gesturing at depth instead of committing to it. It introduces ideas which could have carried entire quests, entire arcs, and rushes past them as if afraid to slow down. I'm glad they keep the story lean and avoid the yapping which bogs down other games, but you can take a good thing too far. And, after all, the game does have a skip button. If they strayed in the other direction, at least we'd have a way out. Mornye deserved more space to breathe. The Heliotic 6 deserved their own entire quest exploring their moral implications and what it says about the world. The Academy, the tribes, the politics, the consequences, all of it feels like fertile ground that's only been lightly stepped on. Maybe future acts will do just that, and make it all feel richer in retrospect. But taken on its own, Act 2 just kept reminding me of how incredible this game can be at its best, then failing to reach the heights it hinted at. I'll just have to hope that Aemeath's story will live up to its reputation. Until next time.